Hi, everybody. This is Dan Liebenson, and I'm back here again with Benay Lappy for another episode of the Oral Talmud. And today we are thrilled to have a guest. Professor Shai Secunda is the Jacob Neusner Professor in the History and Theology of Judaism at Bard College. And our main topic of conversation today relates to his book, which is called the Iranian Talmud, which I've got a copy of right here. And it is reading the Bavli in its Sasanian context. I think a lot of people won't know what Sasanian context is, but we'll talk about that in a second. So first of all, Benay, great to see you again, and Shai, welcome. It's great to have you.
Good to be here.
I just want to say welcome, and it's such an honor to have this chance to talk Talmud with you. So thank you.
And I'm so excited. So thanks for having me.
Sure.
And I should note we'll have a more formal and better arranged introduction in the podcast version of this. So let's just jump right in. Benay and I have been really excited to have this conversation with you and ultimately with other people that are looking at this sort of as historians and really kind of understanding the context within the Talmud, within which the Talmud was written, was composed. A lot of times, and I think Judaism very consciously often looks at text this way, like that doesn't matter. This is out of time. But clearly, I think in academic scholarship, we tend not to agree with that. I was wondering if you could just start a little bit with just a little bit of just some historical or some geographic grounding, if we could, a little bit, just to understand when people who kind of know the map of the Near East think of Babylonia or Mesopotamia, they tend to think of what we call today Iraq, but what your book is about and it's very much about its context as Iranian, or what we think of as Persian. And so could you talk a little bit about what was the geopolitical landscape at that time and what was going on? And I'm also curious, just a side question about that, was the Jewish population of Babylonia, do we know what its relationship was with the Jewish exiles from the first temple? Or, is there a community that was there for a long time? Or is this sort of people that came much, much later?
Sure. So the geographic question is a great place to start. The Talmud, or at least the rabbinic project of the Talmud, knows of itself as a Babylonian project. And actually what you said initially is correct. Babylonia is geographically Iraq. If we want to position ourselves in another way, we could say that it's in Mesopotamia, a Greek word meaning the land between the rivers. And those two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, two really, exceedingly important rivers from antiquity until today. So geographically, we're in Iraq, but politically, culturally, we are under Persian influence. And in fact, we are at the very center of a Persian empire. So let me kind of back up and talk about the geopolitical reality, especially as it has to do with the rabbis who were creating rabbinic literature, including the Talmud. So there are two main centers of rabbinic learning. I'm sure you've spoken quite a bit of this podcast about the rabbinic community in the land of Israel, and particularly in the Galilee. And that sort of foundational, we could say, rabbinic community, which presents itself as rabbinic even before the Babylonian rabbinic community, is in a different political context, is in Roman Palestine, which from really the 2nd century and on was located almost entirely in the Galilee, with some rabbinic action in further southern and southwestern areas. The other major rabbinic center, of course, is in Babylonia, and as we said, in Iraq, mainly between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And there we are talking about a different political, or I should even say, imperial context. So if the Galilee was under Roman rule, I should say, so Babylonia was under Persian rule, and in fact, many ways of thinking about this part of the world during late antiquity is of a clash, or at least two poles of imperial power. Later, this was described as the two eyes, that sort of imperial eyes that gaze out at the world, one being centered in the Roman Empire and the other in the Persian Empire. Now, Persia, as many of you of listeners and people know, is not in Iraq, is in fact further east, and actually historic Persia is what we would call southwestern Iran. So the Persian Gulf is an area known as Fars. And a dynasty began in that region. They sort of made some gains at the beginning of the 3rd century. And then by the time we reach the 220s, and in particular 224, they actually rise to power. They displace the Parthians, which had been the previous dominant Iranian dynasty, and they become the main, that other eye, right, that's looking out at this part of late antiquity. They are centered to a certain extent in Babylonia. They have their winter capital, or at least they're based in the colder months of the year, is in a town known as Ctesiphon, which included areas we might think of them as suburbs, or even kind of, to use modern terminology, part of the metroplex of towns like Mechoza. These are places where important rabbis, perhaps even one of the most important Talmudic rabbis, Rava, called his home. So just to kind of reiterate, we are geographically in Iraq, but we are politically, imperially, under Persian rule.
And just one quick, so is it right to say that in a way that like Constantinople became the capital of the Roman Empire, that this area, even though it's not in Persia, so for some reason they moved their capital to what we think of as Iraq, and why was that? And also, I just want to remind you of the question about like, who are the Jews that are there? Were they from the
yes,
Temple exiles?
Of course. Yeah, so in a sense, this was a natural place even for Persians to establish a new Persian dynasty. I don't think I mentioned their name, but it is in the title of my book that you referred to, which is the Sasanian dynasty. So this was actually a natural place for an Iranian dynasty to establish a capital. I should actually be a little more specific about the terminology I'm using. So I mentioned how Persia, in a certain sense, has a more limited, circumscribed geographic sense. Purely it refers to southwestern Iran, the area of the Persian Gulf. And at least in the languages and the terminology of late antiquity, of the Talmudic period, Iran has a much more expansive sense. So Iran would include Persians. It would also include Parthians. These are people who come from areas to the northeast of Persia, of Fars. So already the Parthians had established an imperial presence. In fact, in that same area, and this even goes back to the dynasty before the Parthian dynasty, which was not, in fact, an Iranian dynasty, but was the Seleucids. They had established a town actually called Seleucia, which was really a sister city, a twin city, we could think of it, from Ctesiphon. It was just across the river. So for that reason, this would be a natural place for this new Persian dynasty, this Sasanian dynasty, to establish itself. Iraq has many things going for it, not just sunshine and good dates, which the rabbis like to extol, but especially it's the breadbasket of the whole region. So in order to be able to fund your economy, your wars, everything that empires like to do, you need to have a place like Iraq, and in fact like this area between the rivers, that is very fertile and very productive. About your question regarding the relationship between the Jews who had been exiled at the end of the First Temple period, what the relationship is between them and the rabbis who who were part of the process of forming the Babylonian Talmud. This is one of the great historical mysteries. We do know, both from the Bible, but also from recently discovered and studied evidence that Jews had already been living in this region in Mesopotamia from the 6th century before the Common Era. We have tablets that refer to a place that translates as Jewtown, Al Yehudu, where we have names of people who have Judean or Israelite names. And they're doing the kinds of things that people do. They're buying and selling things. They're having families. So we know we have, documentary evidence. We have textual biblical evidence that Jews had been living in this area from the 6th century before the Common Era. We then hear about these Jews in various sources. So much later in the 1st century, we hear from the great historian Josephus of Mesopotamian Jews. We hear about it in other kind of Greek Jewish writers like Philo, that there were Jews in this region. But we don't really know what the relationship was between the Jews who had listened to Jeremiah's advice, to plant vineyards and to establish themselves way back in the 6th century before the Common Era, and this seemingly new kind of community, a rabbinic, for the region at least, a rabbinic community that really gets going at the beginning of the 3rd century. Interestingly enough, when that dynasty, the Sasanian dynasty, establishes itself. It's possible that some of these Babylonian rabbis had deep historic roots in the region, but there's also plenty of evidence that some of them, maybe even most of them, were emigres from the Galilee and had moved to Babylonia, perhaps because of persecution in the 130s, the Hadrianic persecutions, perhaps because of economic opportunities. But regardless, we know that Jews were there for a long time, for a very long time. We know that some of the rabbis who call themselves Babylonian rabbis started in Palestine, but we don't really know exactly what the relationship is between this Babylonian rabbinic community and the Babylonian Jews who had been living there for so long.
When do I get to ask my big question? Is it now?
Your big question, or
what did you have a follow-up?
No, but go ahead.
Okay, at the risk of jumping in too soon with my big question, here's my big question. And it's a question that Dan and I have surfaced over the years. Even the most beginning learner of Talmud can feel the difference between the personality of the Mishnah and the Gemara. And the Mishnah, it just seems like such a baldly radical text. It deviates significantly often from the Torah and doesn't seem to need to justify or explain itself for having done so. It just says, Torah says we should do this, we're doing the opposite, done. And then you get suddenly to the Gemara, and I know it seems sudden because it's just, a half an inch further away, but of course it's some 500 years and another culture away. We have a text that, thanks to Shama Friedman and David Weiss Halivni, who have pointed out the role of the Stama, the anonymous editor, we have a text that seems to be shaped by another time and another culture, which either has the agenda, it seems, to bend over backwards to justify those radical deviations from the Torah. Oh, no. What the Mishnah said really is what the Torah always meant because of this verse and that verse and so on. Or if you follow David Kramer, who's my primary teacher, bends over backwards to show just how unjustified the Mishnah's deviation from the Torah is, and emphasizes the rabbi's authority to make those radical deviations. And possibly, as I extend this further, is the Stama, this Iranian influenced editor, trying to give us a manual, an instruction manual for how to radically upgrade the tradition when necessary. So we're always wanting to know what was going on at the time of the anonymous editor or editors that made them have to do this, allowed them to do this, or was influencing this different approach to the relationship between Torah and oral law.
Okay, so that's a lot to chew on. And I want to, first of all, acknowledge that I too am a student of those important scholars, such as Shama Friedman, with whom I actually had the benefit of literally taking a course years ago at Mechon Shechter in Jerusalem. And David Weiss Livni, we are all students of David Weiss Livni. I think you can see in the background some of his books, Makorot and Mesorot, right over here, Sources and Traditions, where he emphasizes the difference between the anonymous layer, the Stama, and the earlier Amoraic statements. That said, I don't think the difference between the Talmud and the Mishnah, which you you capture so well, is only a difference between these later editors and these earlier rabbis. I think we already see really some of the earliest Amoraim, but certainly once things get going, even those Amoraim, even those post-Mishnaic sages are struggling, perhaps proudly pointing out, perhaps sweating while they do it, this discrepancy between Mishnah and the apparent discrepancy between Mishnah and Torah. So I at least the way I want to think about this is that it's not only about the editors versus the Mishnah, but it's about the whole Talmudic project versus the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah certainly presents itself as this very confident, almost pristine text that occasionally will cite biblical precedent, but just starts, talking. I mean, I think the first Mishnah in Shas and the Gemara's explanation of it is a perfect example. It assumes that this is at the beginning of Tractate Brachot. It assumes that that Jews are required to recite the Shema twice a day, and it wants to know a detail about that. When exactly do you recite it? This is typical of the Mishnah, just starting almost mid-sentence, assuming that there is a whole world of norms and expectations, not even justifying that there is in fact an obligation to recite this particular text, right? If you look at the actual text of the Shema, there certainly is an emphasis, even an encouragement, that one should speak words of Torah, generally, perhaps certain sections of Deuteronomy, regularly, right? But the Bible is certainly not envisioning something that like what the Mishnah is describing, that we have a very discrete obligation to recite this specific text in a specific way at a specific time every day. That already is rabbinic innovation. And yet the Mishnah doesn't justify it. It just starts talking. And as students of Talmud know, even students who dropped out after the first page, they know that this bothers the Talmud tremendously, right? The Talmud says, what is the Tana? What is the author, reciter of this Mishnah standing on, right? To assume that we know that there's an obligation, to assume all of these things. And it, right, as Benay described, justifies how, how we got there, right? How we came to know about this obligation. So the problem is certainly there. I think it's an invigorating problem. And the solution, I think, might have something to do with shifts that took place historically, not only in Babylonia, but also in Palestine. Because soon after this text, known as the Mishnah, comes out in the world and is apparently authorized in some sense, because the rabbis really treated, even the relatively early rabbis treated with a certain amount of respect. There's some kind of shift where I don't want to say that the Amoraim lose their confidence, but the Amoraim are no longer willing to ignore this apparently radical departure from what's the Torah and what's and what's happening in the Mishnah. And for that reason, the Amoraim are trying to explain and justify what's happening in the Mishnah. And maybe, as you quoted Kramer, right, David Kramer, maybe that's about emphasizing and even underlining the authority that's given to the Mishnah to do this. I want to kind of add one more thing to think about, is that the Mishnah as a text certainly presents itself as this very confident work, which isn't trying to justify its relationship with the Torah. However, it does come out of a world where there are other texts, both before it and alongside it, that give you a sense that, as much as this confident text that walks into the bar, so to speak, seems very confident and seems like it doesn't need to justify things. In fact, we know that other Jews were writing things and had written things with varying degrees of justification, and even rabbis themselves, even apparently before the Amoraim and the Talmudic project, felt this need. So, for example, we have early versions of Midrash known as Midrashei Halacha, halachic Midrash, things like the Mechilta or the Sifrei. These are Midrashim interested primarily in the halachic sections of the Torah, like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And these Midrashim are fully engaged with the Bible. And not only that, they're trying to figure out often the relationship between rabbinic norms and assumptions, sometimes even lines in the Mishnah or of texts that became part of the Mishnah, and how to square that with the Bible. Right? We also know that other Jewish groups, apparently sectarian groups, had written things sometimes that also struggled to understand the relationship between what the Bible seems to say and what the norm is. And they had various strategies. Sometimes it was about emphasizing a different form of authority, the authority of a righteous, almost prophetic teacher who was able to, work his way through a text and even almost prophetically take things out. There are other things that they did. A text that also was found, that it's also sectarian, was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, known as the Damascus document, that has a little bit of that confidence that we find in the Mishnah. And, there's always a possibility of sort of problematizing what exactly was happening during the period of the Mishnah, where that confidence might have come from, and whether there really is a strict distinction between the Mishnah and the Talmud. But that said, I fully agree with you. This is perhaps the key difference between Mishnah and Talmud. We sometimes forget this. You look at a page of Talmud, and Talmud in the common parlance nowadays means both the Mishnah, right, those little blocks of text, and the Gemara, which interprets it. You might want to read it seamlessly, but in fact, there's something radically different that's happening. I don't know if it's appropriate, to think in these terms about what I like more and what I like less in the rabbinic tradition, but we all have our aesthetic preferences. And I love the world of the Talmud. I love the fact that they need to justify, they want to justify, they want to talk and talk and talk, the way that people who are less socially confident sometimes find themselves doing, when we're in a situation where we're in a new community and we just, ramble. That's something I love about the Talmud. The Mishnah seems to me like the cool kid. who walks into the room and doesn't feel the need to justify. And there's a place for those cool kids. But I do have a certain partiality to the Talmud.
I love your phrase, less socially confident. That's really interesting to me. And again, as a student of Kramer, are they less socially confident, or is it possible that they're more socially confident and really showing you how little they need to justify by making far-fetched, really forced justifications to show you just how far-fetched they are?
Yeah.
But important for selling their innovation to others. I don't know. I'm not sure. But I love that question. There's something that resonates really true for me. As a queer woman, outsider, I know what it feels like to feel less socially confident, and how my learning and my teaching and what I see and how I wanted to learn and master the text and came out of that experience. So that's really interesting.
That's beautiful.
Benay, I just want to tell you that there's like something weird with your mic. I don't know. It was happening last week too. So I'm not sure if it's like when you talk, it sounds a little electronic. So I'm not sure if maybe your thing's not plugged in well, or just letting you, we can work on it after this if it's persistent.
I'll also try to stay closer to it. Does that help?
No, it's not that. It's something electronic. So I don't know see if everything's plugged in well. So I'd love to go deep into this question of, what does it matter that this is happening in Iran under the Persians, and also to sort of take that question as it's not like a simple question. It's like saying what would be happening to American Judaism? Well, it's like that's been a long time. Are we talking about the colonial period? Are we talking about the Civil War period? Are we talking about the 60s? What are we and so so I guess there's also a question embedded into that is like, is it worth asking too much about the Talmud from, in terms of the years 200 until, 450, or is it actually only really interesting to be asking about 450 to 600 or whatever the period that would be the kind of, editorial period? And I guess I'm specifically, I'm wondering about things that relate to what we were talking about, what Benay was just talking about, like the level of confidence. Like you sort of think about it as like, well, a new immigrant is one kind of person and somebody who's been there for 400 years is a different kind of person, both in terms of confidence, but also in terms of maybe how influenced they've been by the society, or maybe how not influenced they've been by the society, because it's like the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox in Borough Park, like the longer they remain, less influenced by the society, like the more special maybe they feel, so I guess I'm wondering, like, all of those different forces, like what, and also like what can we say, like what are the important things that we really can say, whether it's about that period at the end of the editorial period or other periods, in terms of the way in which we should really be looking at some of what's in the Talmud as importantly relating to that Persian context in which the Jews are living.
Yeah, so where do I begin? I mean, the historic, if we could ask questions like we can about American history, American Jewish history, about specific decades or years, then we would love to. The problem is that we often are forced to think about this long period, right, the Talmudic period, as one thing because of our sources. And I mean both our Jewish sources and our non-Jewish sources, right? So, we've all been, I assume your listeners know about these ideas that we've been talking about in terms of the editors and the editorial stage compared with the named rabbis and the differences that might have existed. But at the end of the day, the Talmud that we have, that we study, that we cherish, is a finished product of some sort. And it's very hard to go back and see the parts that ultimately became part of the Talmud, the entire Talmud. right? Sometimes we will find a very old manuscript or even a fragment of a manuscript in the Cairo Geniza, for example, which will give us a little window into a slightly different text, a slightly different world. But even those texts won't really take us back earlier than probably earliest the 8th century. And we're left with largely a kind of finished project. At which point we need to ask ourselves, can we still truly separate between the earlier sources, right, and that final product that we hold in our hands, right? So can we, study the decades? Can we say, well, I can tell you what was happening to Jews in the 220s when Rav and Shmuel, these great foundational Amoraim, were teaching and studying in Babylonian. I can look at what they're saying and what's happening in other texts. But everything is going to be somehow through the prism of this final product that we hold, right? To what extent did those later editors tamper with, or rework, or mess with those earlier statements, those earlier traditions? That's the million-dollar question. And that really does make it difficult to get down to any sort of specificity when it comes to our Jewish sources. To a certain extent, we have it's not the same kind of problem, but it compounds this problem when it comes to our sources that are non-Talmudic. We have very few sources, certainly when we compare them to the kind of sources that we have in the Rabbinic Galilee. We have very few sources that we can pinpoint and point to and say, this will tell us something specific about Jews in a certain place in Babylonia at a certain time. In fact, we have we essentially have no such sources that can give us a place and a date that's directly relevant for Jews. We have Aramaic incantation bowls, which were written, many of them by Jews, which were written for Jews. And sometimes, on rare occasions, they give us a date. They're found at a certain level of an archaeological dig, though most of them are non-provenanced. Or at a very rare occasion, they will even name a date, often a late date, a post-Talmudic date. But other than that, we don't really have sources that will talk specifically about Jews in a specific place at a specific time. All of our evidence, whether it comes from Middle Persian inscriptions, that's the language that was used by the empire, or other sorts of sources by various historians, whether they're writing Greek or Arabic, Islamic historians that are using earlier Persian sources, will tell us very little that can give us a sort of granular, this is what was happening at a specific decade to this specific Jewish community. But that said, right, we're still able to do the best we can to kind of read for trends, to compare, when it comes to the Jewish sources, what happens in the Babylonian Talmud and what happens in the Palestinian Talmud. What kinds of changes appear there. There are, some sources, extra Talmudic sources, that will also give us a greater sense. But unfortunately, we are forced to a certain extent to think about the Sasanian period as this one big whole. Not because there wasn't change happening constantly, but just because the evidence is very difficult to work with. Now, about your question, about, and even the parallel perhaps with different communities that were separated and became more separated or more influenced, right? We might expect, especially if we think that some of the Babylonian rabbis had come from the Galilee, right, had moved to Babylonia, many of them, we would expect some kind of process to take place. Perhaps it would be growing influence. Perhaps it would be, as you pointed out, just the opposite, a reactionary reality that took place. And there are hints of at least this being contested at different points in the Talmudic period. So that early foundational Amorah that I mentioned, Rav, seems to be rather concerned with influence. There are a few passages where he says things that imply that he's concerned. And I'll give one example. This, for those studying Daf Yomi, might be in your memory still. It's a passage in Tractate Shabbat, 75a. And Rav says that anyone who studies with a magus, right, a Zoroastrian priest, is liable the death penalty. Some versions of this text in the manuscript even say have a version where it's anyone who studies a single word, right, is liable from a magus is liable to death penalty. Now, that's a strange statement. If you assume that Jews from the beginning at all times were disconnected from the cultures and the religions that were alongside them. But if you assume, as in fact is the reality, even of course in Haredi Brooklyn, that there are encounters constantly between Jews and others, then one can better appreciate what Rav is reacting to, and perhaps even look behind his very severe statement and find evidence that in fact Jews were learning and were studying with Zoroastrian priests, and for that reason Rav felt the need to react, right? And we have other Amoraim who also seem to be agitated by this possibility. Rav Yosef is another one of them, about a century later. And at the same time, we have examples of rabbis who seem much more comfortable interacting, at least that's how the texts present them, interacting with these others. So Rava, who I mentioned earlier, is presented in stories of talking with the court, the Sasanian court, which even if it's an imaginative process that Jews would say, well, we have a rabbi who has access to the court, specifically to the Queen Mother, Ifra Hormuz. Interesting enough, it makes good geographic sense that someone, a rabbi who lives right alongside the Persian capital, would be within the orbit of the court. And he seems comfortable. He seems interested even in talking with various figures in this world. So we get a little bit of a push and a pull. Sometimes we're able to kind of get a sense of stratification. There is some evidence that the Stam, interestingly enough, seems more disconnected at times. So one example would be some sources that refer to King Shapur. There were in fact two important King Shapurs, one at the beginning of the dynasty in the 3rd century, and the other a century later. For much of the 4th century, he started young and he reigned for a long time. We have a couple of passages in the Talmud that attribute seemingly halachic statements, or at least interest in halachic discourse, to this king, which is interesting and surprising. The Stam, the anonymous layer, when this occurs, says, oh, Shapur, that's just a nickname of either Shmuel or Rava. The Stam is sort of unable to imagine a world where a Sasanian king would take interest in halachic debate. Now that it could very well be, and almost certainly the case, that historically the king never took any interest in such matters. However, earlier, rabbis were able to, or at least wanted to, imagine a world where the king would be interested in halachic discourse. And later, during the Stamitic period, this became unimaginable. Right? So that's one example of many where we can find some interesting distinctions about how Jews found themselves in relation to their neighbors and the empire at earlier periods, and during the Amoraic period, and later periods when the Talmud was redacted.
I feel a little bit like a dog with a bone, but I'm still not wanting to give up on knowing some things about the time period in Iran, Persian Iran, that can help me understand the Stama better. The politics, the literature, you talk about the tradition of religious learning. And I'm wondering if the form that the Stama created was influenced by that. I'm still wanting to picture better what was going on around the stama that I can maybe, connect the dots from.
Sure.
Understand the
So
Talmud better.
I will fulfill this desire. I didn't mean to sort of discount the importance of the stam and the stam's project. Not at all. So I'll say a couple of things. One is the most important. At the end of the day, it is the stam that gives us the Talmud. The rabbis certainly were discussing rabbinic things, the Mishnah and allied texts. They were even preserving them. They were memorizing these teachings. They were reciting them. But it's only the stam, right? Which is a construct, of course. But we have the Talmud because this process took place and was crystallized. And I think that very process could be understood. In fact, can only really be understood when we think about the context in which Babylonian Jews lived, at least at two accounts. One is, in order to create this massive text, almost 2 million words, you need institutions. And there's been a lot of interesting work about the rise of rabbinic institutions, essentially what we call the yeshiva, right? Earlier scholars assumed that the yeshivas existed forever because, in a way, traditional Jews talk about yeshivas existing, not only even before the Torah was given, but even before Abraham. Shem, Noah's son, is a co-founder of this great yeshiva called Shem ve'Ever, right? And this is an important part of sort of rabbinic values to imagine, because learning is so central, that this has been with us since time immemorial. Even in terms of more critical scholars, it had been assumed that from the period of the Mishnah, or at least the Amoraim, there were yeshivas, because there do seem to be references and stories told about various Amoraim in yeshivas. However, going back a few decades, a number of scholars, especially David Goodblatt, and then this was helped by others who sort of fine-tuned his insight, realized that, in fact, all those stories that depict earlier rabbinic sages in yeshivas were constructed later. And in fact, if you do careful work, you find that earlier, rabbis were organized in something like study circles, these small interlinking networks. And later, institutions began to grow to the point where, when we get to the post-Talmudic period, in the Gaonic period, we hear about these massive, impressive institutions that really are kind of the foundation of yeshivas until today. Now, how did that happen? What sort of resources, what sort of changes were necessary in order to that form of rabbinic institutionalization to take place? And it seems that we don't have a clear solution to this, but there are pieces of evidence that suggest that it wasn't only Jews who were undergoing through this kind of institutionalization. And in fact, a neighboring community in particular, Syriac Christians, these are sort of Eastern Christians who made their home in the Sasanian Empire, we're building similar institutions, and we're going through similar processes. So there are a number of scholars who work on the relationship between the Talmud, the Babylonian Jews and Christians, including Michal Bar Asher Segal, Simcha Gross, Yefat Moni Kendam. I've spoken with Simcha recently about some of these ideas, where particularly the institutions that we find growing amongst Syriac Christians may have a lot to teach us about the process with Jews, which then would give us, because you have these big institutional structures, the stam. A second thing that I'll add to that, and this is, I don't want to give too much away because this is the theme of my next book, which may be years away, so I might as well share something, is that I think another related process to what the stam is doing can be better understood if we look at another community, which is the Zoroastrian community. And what I'll say is the stam in the Bavli is not entirely unprecedented in rabbinic literature. Right? The Yerushalmi also has this kind of anonymous voice. It might be less activist. It might be less interested in kind of highly sophisticated argumentation, which is a nice way of putting Talmudic argument. But it was already there at earlier stages and in other places. What distinguishes the Stam and what distinguishes the Talmudic project? Well, one of the things I think that truly distinguishes it is that Babylonian Jews seem to have only given us one gigantic text, one text that's trying to put everything in it, right? People make fun of sort of Talmudic tangents. I don't know if that's in the negative Oxford Dictionary definition, as if to say somehow that, the rabbi's attention is always diverted and they can't follow an argument because, in the middle of a discussion about A, they'll talk about B, and there'll be long, sections about medicine. What does it have to do really with the Mishnah? This is not, I think, what's going on. What's going on is that specifically the Stam, specifically the Bavli, is interested in preserving, although it's a project to explain the Mishnah and early rabbinic tradition, but is interested along the way in preserving as much of Jewish culture, of rabbinic culture as possible for future generations. And it wants to do that in one text. One sea-like text is the medieval way of thinking of the Talmud. We don't get that in the Galilee, right? We have all sorts of texts. We have the Yerushalmi, which is a similar parallel commentary on the Mishnah from the Galilee, but we also have many midrashim as separate books in Palestine. We have Piyut, which is being composed and preserved. We have a whole bookshelf of different books. In Babylonia, we seem to only have one book and one ambitious book to kind of put everything in there using the structure. I think that is parallel to a massive and in fact imperially backed project that the Zoroastrians were engaged in. Zoroastrians and Zoroastrianism is a ancient Iranian religion that has roots as far back as the second millennium before the Common Era and exists today. There are Zoroastrians living all over the world, especially in Iran, India, and a large diaspora in North America, Europe, and elsewhere. And the Zoroastrians and the Sasanians, I should say, were closely aligned with Zoroastrians. They were Zoroastrians themselves, and they had various sorts of close connections with Zoroastrian priesthood. And there is evidence that with imperial backing, they too were trying to create this one massive text that included all kinds of material. Like the rabbis, they were using the structure of an ancient text, right? The rabbis, Babylonian, were using the Mishnah with its orders and tractates. And the Zoroastrians were using their scripture, known as the Avesta, and an organization of it that has something like 21 orders and these smaller elements to then put all kinds of knowledge into one big packaging, which they refer to as the Den, right? Which means something like the religion or the tradition. So, that this thought or this possibility is very preliminary, and I'm still kind of working it out. But it seems to be that, the latter matter which I described, and also the possibility of something similar happening among Syriac Christians in terms of institutionalization, will give us an incredible insight into, first of all, what makes the Bavli and the Stam of the Bavli different, and how it relates to the context in which it grew up. So I hope that satisfied some of your interest in the Stam and what it's happening in its relation to context.
It definitely did. Fascinating. Thank you. I still have lots of questions, but I want to give Dan a chance.
Well, I just along similar lines, can you say why that project was being undertaken at that time, whether it had anything to do with the impending Muslim takeover of the area, which I've heard have been speculated, and so I mean that's one question. I actually on Daf Yomi, I think it was yesterday, maybe 2 days ago, and I think it was Rav who says, has this statement all of a sudden, it's kind of out of context too, that the future of the Torah is to be forgotten, and I kind of wonder whether there's some panic going on, there's some reason why there's some sense of that, but also is the thought process that we think of as Talmudic, this kind of, first of all, like who said what, and this rabbi said, and always trying to figure out who said it, and this whole like just convoluted, logic puzzle type of thing. Is that specific to the Talmud? Is that specifically Jewish, or is that also related to what was going on in Zoroastrianism and other things?
Yeah, great. So, what I described happening in Zoroastrian texts and this project of creating a, massive text is very part of the reason why it's kind of difficult to make this claim is our evidence is complicated. Most of our evidence comes from after, in fact, the Arab conquests. But a lot of this, there's good reason to believe, is describing a textual system that existed well before the Arab conquests and well before the Sasanians ever thought that their empire would end. There's even evidence in the 3rd century, an inscription by this powerful high priest named Kurdir, that the process of creating and reciting and shaping this tradition was already an imperial interest. So, and more broadly, also in terms of understanding how the Babli came to be, there is a very old tendency that we have as Jews to assume that things happen because of destruction or impending doom. And this is true to a certain extent, and these arguments have been made not only, in recent scholarship, say the rise of, certain forms of Kabbalah, being attributed specifically to the Spanish Inquisition, a famous and important claim of Gershom Shalom, or even to an extent the way some of the Rishonim, the medieval commentators, look at the process of creating Talmud also, or Mishnah even. Maimonides takes this approach that there was some kind of problem that led to the need to, put everything together to make sure that it's preserved for the future generations. I am generally skeptical of those arguments, and I think specifically when it comes to the Talmud and the Zoroastrian project, and for that matter, Syriac Christian scholasticism, I don't think that's what's going on, because you need actually a time of flourishing. You need to be able to build these institutions and to keep them going in order to really put together these massive projects. I mean, the Talmud might seem to uninitiated as a kind of slapdash thing, but for those of us who have had the joy of really spending time with it, this is a text that required enormous communal resources, and one would imagine not done kind of on the run. I'm not saying that persecuted people cannot make incredible things, but often they seem to have a different sort of caste. And I don't feel in the Talmud a sense of impending change. I certainly don't feel that in the way the Zoroastrian tradition is described in all of its kind of vastness and intricacy. I think these are projects that were that reflect means and abilities of a relatively stable political situation.
Shai, as a queer reader of Talmud, what jumped out at me almost immediately, the first sugya I learned in my first Talmud class in rabbinical school was hachovel. So this is the passage that describes the shift from the Torah's mandate of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, physical retaliation, to a monetary compensation. Okay. But it seemed obvious to me that what the surface content wasn't the message. It was the process that was used to make a shift on this particular surface content, as an example, the way a case book in a law school would show. And it was very gratifying to me to read in your book that you address this issue of don't mistake the surface content for what's really going on. And I may be overstating it. I'm going to read this line from your book. You say, if there ever was a set of texts whose surface meaning should not be allowed to stand alone in scholarly inquiry, these are they. Can you talk more about what you meant there? And do you think I'm off, or am I on to something?
Definitely onto something. And if I remember correctly, that is in my kind of conventions section of the book. So I am very grateful that there are readers, careful readers, even of those parts that one sometimes assumes will only be read by, your family thinking them and that sort of thing. Yes, I mean, I didn't conceive of it in terms of, queer Talmud, but I think that's a great way of thinking about my approach to the relationship between what the text seems to say, its process, and what's happening in multiple levels. Part of what I meant in that quote was the kind of sweating that we need to do, schwitzing, to use the Yiddish, to wrest meaning from the Talmud. I never thought about it. I'm grateful to you. I never thought about it as something that's parallel to what the rabbis are doing vis-a-vis Torah, right? That, the Torah is saying one thing, and they're saying that can't stand alone. We have to really sweat to find new layers of meaning, new senses. So I'm grateful to you for that insight. I also think, if I understood your comment correctly, that a lot of it is really that the process is what's most important. In fact, right, it's really a performance. It's akin to kind of performance when we think about what the Talmud is doing, right? It's not to necessarily get to a specific law. It's not necessarily even to get to specific understanding, but it's to work through via kind of performance, whether textual or even a bodily performance of reciting the texts and arguing about the text. That's really at the heart of the enterprise. I have to share a story I have from Perek HaChovel, since you shared one with me. One of the best siyums that I ever attended was completion of a portion of Torah, was at a wonderful Beit Midrash at the Hebrew University, a student Beit Midrash called Chevruta. And I learned with them one year Perek HaChovel. And at the end of the learning process, all the students came and they made a nice little party with delicious food. And they brought in a master of Tai Chi who had also been learning through the Perek and tried to explain to us, and I've never actually studied Tai Chi, but I was part of this process, tried to explain to us how understanding bodily movement, especially the kind of fine-tuned bodily movement that one finds in an art like Tai Chi, is essential to understanding this Perek, right? And he even performed for us different acts of violence. No one was hurt in the process. It totally blew open my understanding of this chapter, right?
Wow.
Where suddenly the texts, which were somewhat inert because they were texts, were brought alive by someone who I think was tapping into this energy that really was earning the text by performing these different actions that are described in the chapter.
I love this metaphor of performance, of understanding the way the Talmud moves as a performance, as demonstrates. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We've reached the end of our hours, but we certainly have a lot more to ask you. So maybe we'll get together again another time.
This was so fun. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Okay, nice to meet you.
Thank you so much, Shai.
Okay, see